Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's just start with the first of our panels. We're going to be taking a look at the economic impact of the internet. We've been talking about some of the transformation that is perhaps possible. Is it going to end up transforming the economy of India? And if so, in what manners? And I'd like to invite a very special panel up here. I'm going to begin by Anu Madgavkar, who's the Senior Fellow at McKinsey Global Institute. Anu, why don't you come up? Has done a lot of work in researching and in investigating the full scope of the internet here in India. Elizabeth Bramson from the Economist Intelligence Unit has been really looking at a number of sectors and specifically what's going to happen on the internet. Deep Kaira, founder and CEO of MakeMyTrip.com, perhaps one of the most successful internet entrepreneurs here in the country. Deep, please do join us. Right, there used to be a time when if you were doing a panel like this, we would be all sitting in a room having a conversation. Now, look at the power of the internet already. This is buzzing all over the place in a number of manners that no one would have thought. I've been seeing people, a lot of people right here in this room are tweeting about it. This is rolling out live on ndtv.com. It's going out on air. There's discussion on cyberspace. The entire concept of having a conversation now is increasingly becoming a public and an internet conversation. And now if what Mr. Petroda says actually does work out and we do get that sort of an infrastructure, it will transform society. I guess the big question that we are here to answer in the next 30, 40 minutes is it going to transform the economy as well? If so, to what extent? And how far will that process go? Will it only be a section of people who will benefit from the internet? Or will it actually go down all the way to the most remote of villages and to the bottom of the pyramid? Anu, why don't you start off first, because you have done some research on this. What have been your findings?
So McKinsey's been looking at this issue quite hard over the last year or so in terms of what really is the economic impact of the internet. And as we look at it, we realize that you have to actually look at it in almost 3 steps, or there are three layers to the economic impact. The first layer is sort of the direct economic impact, right? The impact that comes because households, individuals like you and me, SMEs, large businesses, all of us invest in hardware, software, services, and telecom because these enable us to use internet services that we value. And even if you just look at the direct impact of that level of spending, it's actually huge. So globally, we estimate that if you thought about all of the spending as an industry, like you did many other industries, it would be roughly 3% of global GDP, which is about $1.7 trillion worth of spending, which is internet motivated. And in India, that number currently would be about $30 billion, which is about 1.6% of our GDP. Projected to rise to about $100 billion, to your question in terms of what's the forward-looking potential of this, about $100 billion by 2015, which would make just direct internet-related economy at least as big as the healthcare sector in terms of share of GDP. It would make it bigger than the education sector. So the first order impact itself is huge. And in addition, there is a sort of a multiplier impact that it has on other sectors, which is roughly 1.6 to 2 times. And then an equivalent impact of another $100 billion potentially, which is through productivity savings and productivity gains that using the internet imparts on those who actually use it.
Elizabeth, do you want to add to that? And to the extent that, let's just take a look at some of the more advanced, if you like, internet economies, where a lot of things are really moving there, whether it's the United States, South Korea, places like that. To what extent has the internet had an impact on their economies? And what percentage of the economy would now be internet-centric?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us here. I actually think that the particular statistics around the sort of the impact of the internet in the economies of some of these developed markets are perhaps more of the sorts of things that the McKinsey Global Institute research has shown. I think obviously, the internet is far more advanced in the Western world. But within Asia, certainly in Japan and Korea, those are two particular markets that we've been looking at in some of our research. So what we've been doing at the Economist Intelligence Unit, we are the business-to-business research arm of the Economist Group that produces the Economist magazine, is looking at what is happening in terms of internet development, what some of the local players, the platform players, the content providers, what they're doing and what some of the issues are that they're running into that might be perhaps inhibiting or perhaps not enabling internet development to go quite as far as they might have liked. What we definitely see is, certainly within Asia, South Korean and Japanese entrepreneurs and business leaders experience quite a different set of challenges. They're much more competitive challenges. Here in India, the challenges are of a different sort and are much more about really trying to get a lot of the momentum built in the first place.
All right, Deep. Deep, for starters, always gets a slightly nervous expression on his face, and I'm about to start asking him a question because we were in school together and he wonders what horrible stories am I going to suddenly throw out into the internet for everyone to know. Deep, my lips are sealed.
So are mine, Vikram.
I won't tell anybody anything, I promise you. Certainly not when it's out on the internet like this. Okay, tell us about the internet economy, seeing as you, perhaps more than anyone else in this, here has really benefited massively from it.
Sure. Before that, Vikram, you're not my only senior on the panel. So is Anu, by the way.
Okay.
So I have to be on
You have
guard.
other stories?
Yeah.
We'll come to that too.
So I have tons of
no
stories to tell everyone. But let's tell the internet story so far, I think. No, I think the stats shared by Anu and by Elizabeth are really compelling. It indeed is true that this is probably one of the fastest growing sectors in itself today worldwide. When all other sectors are pretty much stagnating, you have the internet really powering on. 8% in developed countries, 18% in developing countries. And in India too, I think what Sam said is very true. We should really focus on what lies ahead. Because if we look back, I think there are only a couple of things which have probably gone right. And in all fairness, I think you have to give credit to the government for a couple of things they did right. A lot has not been done, but I'd like to give credit because I think that was his closing note. So I think
Seeing as their own allies aren't necessarily giving them credit, you might as well.
Exactly. I think IRCTC has been a great example of what the internet can do in a country like India. And I think everyone who's lived in India, and for the benefit of Elizabeth, others who don't know India, so this is our Indian Railways portal, which went live, I guess, in 2002, 2003, and basically just showed the full power of the internet in a terribly fragmented kind of market. I mean, the convenience of the internet, the fact that the alternative, of course, was very painful, just from a cost point of view, because eventually there are tremendous savings which are actually accruing to the railways, therefore to the government because of this. And everyone's pretty much a happier rail traveler, at least in a sense. So I think those are the kind of things which you could do on commerce side. I think e-Chopal, and not so much credit to the government, but as a pretty interesting, I think, joint exercise, largely ITC, is a great example where you can see trickle down, and you've seen tremendous impact actually going down all the way to farmers. Apparently, I think about a fairly large number, I think 5 to 10 million farmers already touched. The plan is to touch maybe 25, 30 million farmers through e-Chopal, and really tremendous savings because the middlemen, commissions have just pretty much gone away. And there are some similar initiatives down south which are on a PPP model like e-Sagu and all doing pretty well. So I think that's been the stuff which has happened well. But overall, I think the scorecard, Vikram, is quite dismal. And I'd be happy to say that because I do say that wearing our NASCOM Internet Working Group hat or any of the other industry hats, we've done nothing about helping broadband to grow. I think it's a big fallacy when we say that 10% of India is online. 10% of India is on narrowband. That's not online. You don't begin to harness the true potential of the internet if you're on narrowband. 1% of India is truly online, is on broadband, and that's the part which has to grow leaps and bounds. And dare I say, I think that thunder is going to get probably stolen completely by the mobile simply because not enough has been done around a broadband policy from the government. So I think there we've had a really, really sad track record. And it would have been a different story right now. We've had enterprises, you've had a few enterprises who've, I think like we used to say for the IT sector, done well despite the government, but not because there have been benefits from the government. And the exciting thought is, what if we had all the right incentives? You would have 100 such companies, you would have a much, much deeper proliferation of e-commerce across, and then deep down, the trickle down, I think, to the villages, to all parts, would have been tremendous. So I think, you know, you can be optimistic like we have to be. And, you know, as an entrepreneur, I am optimistic. So I just love what Sam says. I've heard him before, and I think they mean business. So if we manage to get our act together, just at so many levels in the government, this one can be a huge game changer.
All right, I think you made some very interesting points. Let me ask both of you on that. Anu, at the end of the day, you know, we all know what the promise of the internet is, and we all know how much it could transform everything. But as Deep says, the actual experience has not necessarily been as great as we thought. If you look at the broadband penetration that he's talking about, the numbers that you're at right now are the numbers that we were hoping and expecting 5 years or 6 years ago. That's the actual number. And increasingly, to the extent that people are getting onto the internet, as you're right, again, he said, is largely on the mobile phone, which is not really the broadband. It's certainly not Google Fiber and Kansas, but it's not even what a lot of other places would consider acceptable internet. It's really tough to get connected in good quality speeds.
I agree with you, Vikram, and I agree with what Deep has said. I think one of the things that really comes out through our research, where we benchmarked India with a pool of 57 other countries, which is a fair mix of both, you know, advanced economies as well as developing countries at similar levels of GDP per capita. And we found that in terms of almost all the enablers of a strong internet ecosystem, India actually was bottom quartile, and in many cases, you know, 50 and 52 ranked out of 57, right? And this really reflects a lot of the traditional historical lacunae in internet infrastructure above all else. I think what's really impressive is that despite that, we have a vibrant ecosystem of internet entrepreneurs, and because demographic factors are in our balance or in our favor, you do actually have urban and young India adopting the internet in larger numbers. So if you just double click on the 10% internet penetration, you actually find that, you know, rural penetration is less than 2%, urban penetration is actually reasonably good at about 25%. And you compare that then to the Philippines or Vietnam or parts of Brazil, which are more urbanized, you actually find that adoption rates are quite high.
If I could just interrupt you, the penetration might be 25%, but as he said, at what speeds, what's the connectivity, what can you actually do with that internet connection is another point. I mean, if you're struggling to get email on it, then that's rather sad. No,
and that's borne out by the facts as well, which is that typically, you know, an Indian online consumer is spending 1/4 the time of his Southeast Asian counterparts online, and the quality of that experience is not great. But I think potentially there is another model that we have to plan for India, right? Even in a base case view, even if you don't think about internet going to, you know, 200,000 villages, if you just think about the number of internet users going up 3 times to about 350 million, I think India will be unique in that 3/4 of this growth is likely to be mobile and tablet only, right? And it's almost the only country in the world which has this kind of outlook, because most of the other developing countries would have, you know, 10 to 15% mobile only usage. So what I'm trying to say is that this is almost in the base case, right? And therefore this is something that all the ecosystem participants will have to sort of design for, in terms of what does it mean to have small screens, what does it mean to have low text, what does it mean to have you know, the whole interface being mobile driven. It's maybe a different type of evolution of applications, for example.
I think that's already happening, Deep, right? A lot of people who are in the internet in India have already realized this some time back, and their focus is really largely mobile driven or device driven, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Anu's right in saying that in India, people are going mobile first, and because, you know, there is no alternative in a sense. So we actually have some really exciting apps happening in India right now, and developments happening in India which are mobile only. There are some in the US, a few, but a lot of folks have taken a cue from those. So if you look at a very exciting company out here called Zomato, which is, you know, modeled on OpenTable in the US, Zomato is seeing growth rates of their mobile penetration going absolutely berserk. So apparently they've gone from like 30, 40% to 60% in the last 6 months. Now, if someone was to take a cue from that, and it could be a local cab company, it could be someone aggregating taxis, they'd say, why should I build a big screen application at all? What's the need? Why wouldn't I just go mobile only and focus, because we all know it's all about focus out here, whether it's this phenomenal company called Google or anyone else. It was all about focus on one thing. So if you get the focus right on the mobile, and then you let the other people just do like the iPad has a 2x iPhone experience on the iPad or whatever. So people are really going moblet a lot, so mobile and tablet a lot, which is indeed true. But that won't solve all the problems is what I feel. So just for a minute, if we stick with SME, and which is so exciting for our country, because our country is really going to get driven by the SME engine, and that's pretty clear to everybody. So if you look at SMEs, and I think this is a McKinsey study or probably one of the other folks who said that small and medium enterprises that embraced the internet over the last, I guess, decade grew 10%. However, those who didn't actually declined. So I think the message is clear for small and medium enterprises. You either embrace the internet, you internetize your business, or you run the risk of perishing. Now, that's the kind of business which may not take off. And I'm going to take an example which necessitates me taking two bad words in one sentence, but I'm going to talk about China and Alibaba together. So, no offense, but if you think about it, and from Google's point of view, of course, so if you think about Alibaba in China, that company is just phenomenal in terms of the fact that millions of SMEs have come on board this platform almost. It's a company, but it's actually a platform, and have reached out to millions of customers around the world they could have never done, and this has helped the overall economy. And I find that one example could work so beautifully for India, because we've got these tiny SMEs, manufacturers all across the country. India has grown up with industrial belts in Punjab and in smaller remote parts of each and every state down south, etc. There are handicrafts coming from all over the country. How do these folks find a great market and an exciting market and a global market beyond the folks who visit those places or the local markets? And something like that perhaps will not happen that well if you're mobile only. For that, you probably need a big screen experience or a mid-screen experience. You need hand-holding. I think Google's program, and I've been involved a bit from the side with Rajan when he talked about 100K startups. I just think it's so exciting because that's what the country needs. And I think in some sort of way, you guys are trying to address that very same thing. There's a lot of talent out there. Let's help them come up. In this case, those 100,000 startups will come up on the internet. But I think at the same point of time, you can have 1 million existing companies, which are SMEs, leverage the internet.
So there are two slight aspects to this. One is the extent to which the internet economy itself works, and the second is the extent to which the internet will enable other companies in the offline world to really transform their businesses. So I'll take both of them in a minute, but Elizabeth, if I could just come to you on the other point that we were just talking about. To the extent that in India the full potential of the internet is still a promise and not an actuality, what do you think, taking from global experiences, what do you think that India has done wrong so far, which it might try and fix now? We've actually been hearing from the government for a long time. This is the big thrust focus area, and it should be. What have they been doing wrong?
So our research, which looked at what internet entrepreneurs, platform providers, and content companies around Asia, what they felt was preventing them from becoming truly global players. So why don't we have an Indian Google? Why don't we have an Indian Apple? So the questions that we asked were about, what are the explanations? Is it about talent? Is it about regulation? Is it about infrastructure? And there were a lot of interesting points that I want to just share that get to answering your question. So generally speaking, the feeling was that within Asia, so within their sort of home region, oftentimes within the home market, there were big enough challenges that the global frontier had not yet become something that really made sense to put on the agenda. So we've got enough to handle here in India, we've got enough to handle here in Thailand, in China, whatever it was, that going regionally was going to present some challenges, things like having to think about, obviously Asia Pacific is an extremely heterogeneous region, unlike Western Europe, where there's much more commonality in terms of culture. Languages might be disparate, but the culture is really quite homogenous. Obviously, North America is quite homogenous. So there are some particular inhibitors there. So the other thing is that in general, there was a feeling that there are some real challenges on the monetization side, which I wonder about your perspectives here. So for example, if you want to develop a real content business, getting people to understand that sort of paying for content is something that one might need to do, is a bit of a cultural disconnect. And also there's obviously some issues with piracy. And so if you're able to get pirated content, why would you pay? In fact, sometimes it was the difficulty of finding a good way to pay for content that led people to go to pirated solutions. But interestingly as well, I think there are challenges in terms of online payments, this difficulty of, there's relatively low credit card penetration, then there's a lot of fraud. We talked to someone in Indonesia who runs an e-commerce site, and as soon as they enabled online credit card transactions, immediately 40% of the next sort of 3 or 4 days time period of transactions were fraudulent. So obviously they shut that down. But there's obviously some concerns about how to go forward with this. Regulation is something that came up. So in terms of what the government's done wrong, I think the feeling was, I think on the telecom side, in terms of telecom infrastructure and the uncertainty and the opacity around what exactly is going on with the, both the wireless and as well as things in terms of the broadband development, those are things that were certainly cited. In terms of regulating the way that, for example, third-party providers need to police content, there's a lot of lack of clarity. So entrepreneurs that we spoke with and internet leaders here in India said, well, we're not even sure if we're liable anymore. Are we liable for third-party content or not? And there tends to be an inclination to shut down the site rather than to ask for that perhaps fraudulent content to be removed, which might be perhaps a little bit of an over reaction. And so there are some concerns around really taking those risks. And so, for example, there was an entrepreneur that we spoke with here who runs a site that puts classified ads online. And they have 100 people. And I realize the numbers in India are not the same as they are in, say, the United Kingdom or the US. But still, 100 people is a lot of people policing content. Now, the question is, would those resources be better used somewhere else? Most definitely. Right. So those are the sorts of things that came out of the research. And although we're sort of reluctant to get into it's the government's fault or it's not the government's fault kind of argument, what we're trying to do is bring out what we heard from the people who are actually doing business here.
Right. Deep, you probably relate to a lot of that. And let's start off with monetization, though, for the pure internet, right? Internet companies. In India, there seems to be a real problem because if you look at the amount that's going in advertising, for example, so let's look at the content players, the amount that you're getting for advertising is almost laughable when you compare to equivalent benchmarks anywhere else in the world. And then you have the transactional sites or the e-commerce sites, and other than you or a couple of others, most have really struggled to make money. So how do you monetize the internet in India if you're an internet-only company?
Yeah, no, I think that was a fair comment. I think if you're largely a content play in India, it's not that easy simply because it's linked to the kind of time and the quality of time you're spending on the internet. So it comes back actually to the whole rich media experience. If you have, if you have the ability to enjoy rich media. But
actually, even if you are offering rich media, even in that section, it's not necessarily that easy to monetize. Even if you're looking at people who are watching video streams and the others, they're not necessarily, you're not getting advertisers to pay for that, what you might be able to get in the United States or anywhere else.
Yeah, I think in one of the many roles you've held at NDTV, I think you've seen that for yourself. It's not been easy. You guys offer rich media, and I'm saying, Vikram, the point is how many guys can consume that rich media in the way that you want them to consume it. Yeah. And the moment it ceases to be a pleasure, then that affects the experience. There's also a cultural thing out here, I think, and most of us Indians know that. We don't like to pay for stuff which we can get away without paying. I mean, it's just, it doesn't happen so easily. So I don't think the economists with their premium subscriber program out here would do that well. And I'm sure you have. It just wouldn't, because we'd find ways of getting that content to us in more interesting ways. However, there's a point that you made. However, there's a point that you made earlier, which I think is actually something which needs to be clarified, Elizabeth. So actually today, payments is not an issue at all. So payments in India, and again, I've got to give credit to the government out here, because two-factor authentication changed the game for e-commerce payments in India and fraud in India. Two-factor authentication was one of the boldest moves they made. It was 2.5 years ago. I remember transactions for everyone fell off a cliff. You had some time to prepare for it, but then after that, it's fraud which has completely nosedived. So it's actually got under control over the last couple of years, much lower than, so we also have a US site and a site in some other countries, and we see fraud levels being much higher there. And thanks to two-factor authentication, you can argue that it becomes a little limiting for small value transactions, and there's work being done around that. And I think a couple of bodies, again, NASSCOM, Internet Association, Shubho's right here, doing a lot of work to try to convince the government there's certain smaller value recurring payments which should not come under that net. So again, subscriptions and like. The other point is that while credit card holders are only probably 20 million with 40 million credit cards, 2 per head, but we have about 200 million people with debit cards which are now allowed to be used on the internet as well as net banking. So there's actually no issue out there. We have more people who can pay via plastic or online than people who are actually online. So that's not an issue today. Vernacular is an issue today. I think in vernacular there's actually a huge opportunity today because we don't have good quality content beyond news on vernacular sites. So there's a lot of interest there. But I think in terms of monetizing, Vikram, we'll see media pick up. I think the challenge will be as our internet growth gets driven largely on the smaller devices, media becomes a bigger challenge. And that's what's happening. So on the mobile, everyone's struggling. You know, the biggest of companies, the smartest of companies around the world are trying to figure out how do I monetize my mobile content and what people are seeing on the mobile. So I think that's going to be the challenge. So I don't think we'll ever hit the kind of percentage rates that e-commerce sites will make from media. In our business, you know, the kind of money that, let's say, Expedia makes as a percentage of the overall revenue from media is many times higher than ours. And we struggle and we're trying to figure out ways around it. But dollar to dollar, it's difficult.
All right, we have about 3-4 minutes more to go. So Anu, if I could just ask you on one of the other things that did emerge from what both the Minister, Mr. Kapil Sibal and Sam Pitroda were saying, it's about the extent to which the internet can transform lives of people in the most remote parts of the country and at the bottom of the pyramid. What's the sort of research and finding? Is anything happening on that? Is it really transforming people's lives or not yet? I mean, e-governance, I guess, is making an impact, but how about in other areas?
I think there again, the promise is immense. There are some of these critical enablers, the pipes need to be laid and the last mile connectivity needs to be there, and then you need a host of vernacular-based applications. But there are several areas where we've seen, so for example, this whole enablement of cash transfers, right, direct cash transfers, which in a way is enabled through internet-based platform, has this huge impact in terms of really plugging leakages, right, which can be as high as 50% in many of these cases. In the social sector, in health and education, some models that we've seen which do leverage the internet bring down the cost per consultation or the cost per child education intervention down some to 20% or 10% of what the offline cost would be. So the the potential is just immense. I think in addition to everything, this whole notion around digital literacy, right, and maybe thinking about how do you really make SMEs, small ones, or individuals going forward, if you're thinking about 500 million Indians online and using these services, there is a huge agenda in terms of digital literacy, maybe this cadre of para-technicians or someone to act as sort of intermediaries to help people navigate this whole system, which maybe banking coordinators, for example, in rural areas could become these guys. So there is this whole rural ecosystem which will flourish around this, provided the basics are in place.
Elizabeth, there used to be a time we used to say the internet is going to increase inequality, sharply so, the digital divide. Now what we seem to be hearing is actually it could potentially work the other way.
Which is to say reduce inequality. Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we've seen certainly in developing markets elsewhere in the world is the extent to which the internet has given a voice to perhaps populations that haven't necessarily been able to speak. So for example, the events in the Middle East during the Arab Spring were certainly exemplary in terms of the extent to which people were able to understand that they weren't alone and that there was, in fact, a whole range of other people feeling the same level of distrust and unease. And obviously we covered that very closely at The Economist and at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And I think we all believe that the extent to which connectivity in the internet needs to be given a great deal of credit for the events that took place there. So I think that's some of it.
Deep, final quick thoughts for you. A lot more people traveling now on your portal than were earlier.
Yeah, clearly I think business has been good. Could be better, of course, always. But I think more important than just traveling, I think it's that default, go-to space. So I've got a 13-year-old and 11-year-old, and the harshest punishment we can give them when they've done something wrong is a no-screen day. So a no-screen day is a complete shutdown of everything they do, except if they have to use it for work, so they can go to Wikipedia and they can do it for work. And if you think about it, and I was just thinking about this driving out here, look at our lives. I don't think there's one of us, and this is obviously a skewed audience, but imagine a day without the internet at home, not up in the hills, not out on the sea. It's just something we can't imagine. And for most of us, we got experience to this thing not so long ago. So I think it's just dramatic. It's just fascinating how it's changing our lives. I think the fact that you can be in a remote part of the country and you can watch cricket being streamed on your mobile phone is pretty exciting if you think about it. So you're no longer disconnected. So I think the future is very bright.
Right, and let's hope that connectivity continues to improve so you don't end up with no screen days for factors other than being punished because you did something wrong.
Right.